Welcome to this episode of Turning Grief into Growth, the Journey of Transformation. This is a podcast that's hosted by Greg Jacobs and Don Lipstein. Well, good day, Don. How are you doing today?
Couldn't be any better, Greg. We have a
Perfect.
really good program scheduled, I think.
I'm excited about today. We have a guest that is joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Don, and let you introduce our guest for today.
Well, thank you. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous because of our guest. She she's special, and you'll find out why just by listening to this podcast. But Kim Burditt Bartlett, she's a master. She has her master's in social work. Knows firsthand the heartbreak of suicide loss. In 2010, her younger brother, U.S. Marine Corps veteran John Hoffman, died by suicide, changing her life forever. Since then, Kim has devoted her career to supporting grieving families and advancing suicide prevention. She has spent over a decade creating trauma-informed programs, events, and resources for survivors, and today serves as Senior Manager of Family Engagement for the Black Box Project at Stop Soldier Suicide, a groundbreaking initiative using digital data to better understand and prevent suicide. I think we'll learn more as we talk to her about that. A New England native with a tucked away Boston accent, Kim brings warmth, honesty, and humor to her work. She's also an online grief group facilitator, big dog enthusiast, and tattoo lover. And while not an adrenaline junkie, she once jumped out of a plane at 14,000 feet and says she'd do it again. And I want to start right there. You are the reason I did a jump as well. A year later, after you did, you were my inspiration. What was that like?
Oh my gosh. How do you put it in words, Don? Right? Like I was so excited for you. I told you I was literally like in my kitchen yelling like woo, like jumping up and down
I
because
think his
when you told
smile
me.
put it into words whenever he sent me
Yeah.
the picture. I think that was enough. And I think my response to that is, boy, I don't think I could ever see myself doing that. But I think Don is determined to get me out there to do that. So we'll see what
I
happens.
probably said the same thing, Greg.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I ever had a desire to jump out of a perfectly functioning airplane, but it was incredible. It really was. It was just Dawn and I talked about it after that, as it will come out in our conversation today, I feel like Dawn and I sort of grew up together in, kind of doing this work, right? I mean, um, there are people that you meet along the way that become more like family. And I don't use that term lightly, but um, we were both at a place, I think, for that jump where, we weren't maybe feeling stuck in our grief or, not really at a place that, it didn't feel like this ginormous breakthrough event for me. It was just incredibly grounding. Like, I still don't have the right words to, I don't think it didn't change my whole life that day. Everything changed. I don't want to be that dramatic, but um it really just cemented in a way like that I I don't know. I knew before that I could do really hard things, but that I can do hard things and I can honor it. It's just such an amazing opportunity when you have them like that, and you don't get many of them, to do big things in honor of our people, right? And it was, yeah, Don and I, we kind of stumbled around trying to describe it a little bit. You just got to do it. You just got to do
Uh,
it.
I
yeah,
think I think the grounding aspect is an interesting analogy when you say it was so grounding, considering you take the ground out from underneath your feet. But I
Right.
could see that. I could totally see that as being almost
I didn't even think of
stabilizing,
that.
being out of control, kind of letting go. I could see where that could be grounding. Yeah.
I
Yes.
love that. I love that description of it because I haven't been able to find the words myself to
Yeah.
describe it. But
Well, I think that's copyrighted by Kim now, so you can't use that one. It's trademarked.
Mhm.
So, Kim, why don't you tell us your story? And I mean, I know that we could take up the whole podcast doing that, but as briefly as you can. And I know that you have other grief besides just John. Um, so let's hear your story and we'll get into it.
All right. Um, it's hard to imagine that there was a time in my life that was not defined by grief and loss, right? And I don't mean to say that, to imply that, every day is a horrible day for me. It's not at all, right? I mean, I am in a place right now. I am so fortunate. I love my life. I just feel so incredibly lucky and blessed to get to do what I do and to have the life I have. But when I look back like to the before, there's the before and there's the after. My before, gosh, right? Like I always say, like we are blissfully ignorant. And wouldn't I love to go back and be blissfully ignorant again? My family had experienced loss. So I grew up in, a pretty normal suburb of Boston. My pretty solidly blue collar. My dad was a mechanic, his whole life. My mom worked part-time and raised myself. And then my only sibling was my younger brother, who was almost 11 years younger than me. Um, my grandmother died when I was in college. I had an uncle, actually, when I was younger. I didn't know him well because he lived in another part of the country, but I had an uncle that was killed in a plane crash in Michigan, even before my brother was born. So, but again, I didn't know him, so it didn't feel like loss to me, right? I didn't feel like a strong grief. And my family, he lived in Michigan, and all the rest of the family was in Massachusetts, so it didn't really impact, us sort of in a tangible way. Um, and then my brother died in April of 2010. And again, John was my only sibling, almost 11 years younger than me. And I used to joke, and I still sometimes do, it sometimes felt like we were raised by two separate sets of parents. We weren't, right? My parents were his parents. My parents were together until the very end. Um, but my mother was 38 when she had John, and she used to say they give babies to young people for a reason because the stamina was completely different. I would have toast and Cheerios and, apple juice if I was lucky. And my brother got to have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle cereal and Pop-Tarts and juice boxes, which was a big thing in the 80s, right? Um, so, it was very different. But so, John and I, we had a close relationship, as close as I think you could, given our age difference. I mean, I was going to the prom and he was 5 in kindergarten.
Hmm.
As he got older, and I mean older, sort of the last few years of his life, that age gap started to not feel as impactful because, when we're adults, whether it's, 5, 10, 15 years, it may not make a huge, it just doesn't make as much of a difference as it did. So, John was in the Marines. He was not in the Marines for a very long time. He was out of the Marines actually for 6 years when he died. Excuse me. And he, look, even knowing what I know now, looking back, even with, working in the field for the last, 14 years or whatever, um, I still don't see a lot of signs. I still don't see a lot of warning signs with John. He was by nature kind of an introvert anyway. He was a homebody. So some of maybe the warning signs that might, that they tell you to look for, right? Um, when someone is struggling, that was just, kind of John being John. He had a very small circle of friends and he just liked being home. But there were, like I said, it didn't seem like there were a lot of warning signs. So it felt really out of the blue when he died by suicide. And my mom, that day, unbeknownst to us that there would be another type of decision, but that day she said, "We have to tell the truth about this." I guess we have to tell the truth about this. And it didn't occur to me either way, that we would, that we really would speak about it in a way that, let people know exactly what happened. He died at home. He used one of my dad's firearms and, or would we need to sort of concoct a story around it? And when again, knowing what I know now, I know that decision was incredible. And really so much foresight on the part of my mom to be able to say like, okay, so this is how he died, and we loved him, and it doesn't define who he was, and it doesn't, and I don't think she was even really conscious of all of, the implications of this, but um we were truthful about it, with the exception of my two kids. So, there's one little regret there, that if I had known better, I think I would have done better. My two children were 8 and 6, well, just almost 7, 9 and 6.5, when my brother died, and my two girls, and they were extremely close with my brother. We didn't know what, we really, although my mom said, like, yes, we're going to tell the truth about this, we're going to be honest, I really didn't know how to explain it, even like, amongst ourselves. So, we immediately thought, how are we going to explain it to our kids, right? Like, how are we, my then husband and I, and my parents made a decision to tell my children that they called him Uncle. Uncle had a sickness in the brain. You could not see it, you could not catch it. Because I thought, oh, if they think, that mommy and daddy are going to have it. He did not die in his sleep. And by the time they called my dad Boppy, by the time Boppy found him, he had already died. Um, we essentially omitted that it was self-inflicted, right? Um, and I always knew that later on in life, they would need to know. They would need to know the truth, that this is part of our family history. It's part of our, their mental health history. They would need to know the truth. But at that point, at that age, I didn't know what to do around it. So we were hush hush in front of my kids for a year and a half. And I thought about, I prayed for an opportunity to tell them the truth. I really did. I was like, all right, when it's the right time, make it plain to me, and give me a way to tell them, help me learn to tell them in a way that is going to, is understandable for them, with what they need to know, right? I think we have a tendency with kids, we feel like we have to kind of vomit out the whole everything to them when, something happens. And kids just need to know what they need to know, and they'll tell you, and they'll ask questions when they're ready to get those answers. But it was about a year and a half in that they're presented that opportunity. My kids were exposed to something around suicide, and they were, and I'm like, okay, like, here it is. And at that point, they were in fourth and sixth grade, and my fourth grader, it was like we were back to day one with her. She was very close with John, and it was, we were back to grief day one with her. My sixth grader, the older one, I think suicide was kind of in her, she was in middle school, so suicide was kind of in her, sort of orbit anyway. And, she understood it, or seemed to, absorb it, acknowledge it, differently than her sister. The reason I bring that up is because fast forward a few years to my older one, Kirby, and she's going to go to school for a psychology degree. She's actually just finishing up her occupational therapy program to get to be an OT right now. But she was going to start with a bachelor's in psych, and she's writing her college essay for, to apply to colleges. And the essay is about why she wants to help people, and it links to, the tragedy in her family. And the theme through it all was that she was lied to by, her parents lied to her about what had happened with her uncle, but she understood why. And that's what, one of the drivers for her to go into a helping profession, because she knew that there was stigma, and she knew that, families who experience traumas like this need
Kim,
support.
I don't want to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
how did that make you feel? As
Oh, I
far
was
as
just
whenever
going to
you,
say,
yeah,
like, stab to the heart, right?
yeah,
I mean, I get it. right?
Sure.
But also I was like, oh, oh my gosh, like,
Yeah.
you know, and I think as parents we wonder, right? Are we doing a good job? How do we even know? I mean, my kids I think they're phenomenal human beings today, but I'm sure I've made my share of mistakes, and there's one of them, and she called me out on it, right?
I always
Well,
find
Um,
it
and
very
and
good, Don.
just the fact that she was felt comfortable and safe in calling you out
Yeah.
on that, I
yeah,
think speaks to how you raised her, you
I
know.
hope so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
I always
sure.
find it creative whenever they are quick to share with us our shortcomings, and it's always I'm always very quick to be humble about it and say, something I could have done things differently and better, hindsight
Yeah,
2020. But thank you because
yeah.
it'll help me going forward and helping me give advice to other young parents. So yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I distinctly remember, I remember the feeling. I don't remember where or when it happened, but that first realization that, oh my gosh, my parents are actually people and
Mhm.
they screw up and make mistakes and, and they're not right all the time. Huh, like that, as a child, that first realization. But I think it also is it's really helpful, I think, to get that realization and that, okay, so they're just human beings too, and we all need to give each other some grace and some space around, that especially, when we go through things that we've never done this before. We don't have any context, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I have the right intent. So she had,
Uncharted waters.
oh my gosh, right?
Yeah.
With no compass, with no map, with no which I'll segue off of that, jump off of that sense of like my family being like, okay, this we are thrust into this wilderness of suicide loss, and we had no idea what we were doing. Luckily enough, the day that John died, you talk about unlikely helpers that kind of show up or, through these experiences. The day that John died, so as I shared, he died at home. In Massachusetts, your homeowner's insurance will cover a cleanup service.
Mm.
Who knew, right? The local law enforcement told us that and said, here's a list, pick one. Well, we just picked the one at the top, right? They start with ABC. That was their name. So we were like, all right, they're at the top of the alphabetical list. We'll go with them. Um, the truck shows up later in the afternoon, and the gentleman that gets out of the truck asks me, where's the homeowner? I need to speak with the homeowner. Um, and so I bring him to my dad, and I say to him, I'm like, buddy, you have a really crappy, that's not the words I used, but I'll censor myself. You have a really crappy job. And I'm like, and I said, God bless you. And he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, God bless you. He's like, honey, this needs to be done. And Lord knows you can't do it. Your family can't do it. Someone needs to do it. And he's like, this is what we do. This is what we're here for. And he hands my dad a book. And it was a book by an author called Dr. Carla Fine, and it's all about suicide loss. And she wrote a book about when her husband, who was a physician, killed himself in New York City. And that was the first, on, day one, the first introduction to my family that there was any type of specific support for this. And that caused my dad, because he was a Googler, to Google and do some research. And that connected us first to local suicide specific support, peer support. And then later that connected us to TAPS, the organization. Well, I was connected to one person and then was connected to the organization. And that's how I met Dawn. And that really, kind of, it's interesting. That one act by that guy giving my dad a book, and he wrote in the book, I'm so sorry for your loss. I hope that you find this a little helpful. Much care, Tim. My parents later found that guy and reconnected with him. It was kind of neat, but he didn't know John was going to die that day. We didn't know John was going to die that day, right? He just keeps those in his truck for when
Wow.
there's a need. Pretty impactful, right? Like that completely changed the trajectory of my family's grief and how we navigated this.
Which you
The
wouldn't think
fact,
just a book handed out would do that, but it's the
right.
planting of the seeds along the
Yep.
way and the
You
watering
never
that
know.
comes along. You just don't know.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Yep.
So
You
true.
never know. It was, I mean, really, that book, I mean, taught us the term suicide loss survivor. I had never heard that before. Like, why would you, right? Like, again, we had no context for this, right?
Right.
Um, and my first experience in grief support was peer-based, right? Going to a suicide-specific support group, connecting with other suicide loss survivors, not grief experts, not clinicians, although, I know there is a very appropriate place for clinical professional counseling and treatment, and it layers beautifully with peer support. But for me, it was peer support. That was what it was, connecting with people who got this, and that really cemented it for me. And that's really, I mean, the lens that I work through now. That's been my whole career in working in group suicide prevention and postvention, caring for families impacted, is through that peer-based lens. And it truly, there's something really I mean, research supports it, but there
Yeah.
really is something magical about it. There really is. Um, so, John's death largely clearly redefined my career. I very early on, and by early I mean probably 6 weeks in, had, I remember in my kitchen at the time, it felt like a dream, but I was awake. It was almost like a vision of, I'm going to do something with this. And do something meant, I didn't exactly know what it meant. The vision was me standing at a podium speaking to people, which was not my life before, right? I was working part-time. My kids were little. My bachelor's is in communication and marketing. So I did have a little bit of like events management and marketing background, but I wasn't doing that at the time because I was home, raising my kiddos. But that feeling of, I'm going to do something with this. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it would pan out to be. I just very clearly knew I had to make space for it in my life. And so I started to do that, and I started to volunteer, and that led to a part-time job, which then led to, a full-time job actually at TAPS. That was my first full-time position, sort of in the grief support world.
And
It,
real quick, Kim, for those that don't
yeah,
know what TAPS is, that's Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors.
yes,
It's for military loss. That's where I
yes.
actually met Don as well,
Hmm.
and the connection that we have. So all three of us have that connection with TAPS. But
Yeah,
excuse me, for our listeners out there that don't know what that is, that's what she's referring to.
yeah. Thank you for that, Greg.
Yeah.
Um, And 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 again, my brother was out of the Marines for 6 years. We didn't, New England and the Northeast were not a super military heavy, sort of area of the country anyway. So we didn't initially even think to like seek out any military related support. It kind of didn't define us. It just didn't, John was a civilian and was when he died and was before, and so we first engaged with local support. And then was plugged into TAPS. Actually, when I started working for TAPS, we never actually, as a family, engaged with TAPS for support. It wasn't until I started working there, and then my
Mm.
parents got involved. And my parents were, they both became, TAPS has a program called a peer mentor program where you can essentially be trained to be a mentor, a friend, right? A buddy to another person who has experienced the same loss that you have, the same type of loss, the same relationship. If you're a dad, you'd get connected to a dad. Um, and it's about that peer connection, someone who gets what you are experiencing because they have experienced it too. And all those details may not line up, but that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Um,
As much as you wish that no one else would know the pain, it is so helpful knowing that you're not alone, right?
oh my gosh, incredibly validating,
Yeah.
right? Like, and affirming, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one that has had this experience. I'm not the
Right.
only one that has had these thoughts. I'm not the only one that people have said these horrible things to. Again, it doesn't fix it. It doesn't
Right.
soothe your grief in a way that you might wish it would, but that affirmation, that validation, is incredibly healing. It really
Agreed.
is. Both my parents became peer mentors. My dad had found so much meaning in that. I mean, my dad found my brother.
Mm.
And he had, some pretty, pretty, I mean, I would say severe. He might not have used that word, but um, post-traumatic stress related to that, as you would expect, right?
Yeah.
But he found so much meaning and in again connecting with other dads. He made some friends that became more like family, truly, where he would one of them, Dawn, you know well, Dana O'Brien. I mean, they spoke 3, 4 times a week for like 3 hours at a whack, like the two of them, and they just became, best friends and would never have had any reason or opportunity to meet if it weren't for their losses, their individual losses. Um, my dad found a lot of meaning in writing. He would write, actually, he back before, talk to text was a thing. This is maybe 10, 12 years. Well, yeah, about probably 11 years ago. My dad sought out and purchased a dictation
Mm.
software because he couldn't type quickly. But so he would sit at his desk with his big headphones and talk and record his, he would write about his feelings about John. He would write his personal testimony. He would write about his personal experiences. It was amazing. Um, so much meaning and purpose, I think, found, because of the loss of his son. And he, up until the day he died, he would tell you he cried every day still. Um, my dad actually, it was 6 years after my brother died. In the 6 years after he died, you want to talk about, knowing how grief affects us physically.
Yeah.
He had never had any heart issues before my brother died, and he had never had a heart attack until
Mm.
the one that he died of, but he had 6 stents in the 6 years after my brother died. So, I mean, I know that his health was profoundly impacted.
It,
He,
it's almost like that saying, people die from a broken heart.
Mm.
yeah,
And that sounds like that's exactly what happened with him.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I could totally relate with that. I didn't have any heart issues, and then I'm on three different high blood pressure medicines, and I've got sleep apnea, and
yeah,
just all kinds of stuff. So grief definitely takes a physical aspect to your life and draining, and that's where you just have to fight against it as hard as you can.
yeah,
But yeah, I can
yeah,
relate, Kim.
yeah, yeah. Um, so when he died in 2016, it was, it's interesting because in the span of the last, gosh, 15 years, I have experienced divorces, I have experienced, the loss of my brother, both my parents, and every one of those losses, it's so strange to say, because John's death was so impactful and because we as a family, I mean, it didn't define us as a family, but it definitely defined the work that we do, right? Like kind of like what we stood for as a family and still do, right? Um, in the way that we approach life, in the way that we value relationships, in the way that we, how we appreciate each other, our authenticity, right? Like my whole family, and I learned that, I mean, I think from, so much exposure to the people I, count as new family that I met through TAPS, but just like all of that defined who we were and how we do life. And that served me so well in my future losses, right? So when my dad died, completely different, right? Like I was a daddy's girl. I was an only child for, so
Mm.
long before John died. And then, then after, um, I had felt the sole responsibility for my parents, right? Like, in fact, the day John died, that was one of, I think, my clearest thoughts was, it's all on me now, all on me.
Could be a
Being an
heavy
only
burden.
child again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, and not even knowing what that really meant, right? Although I eventually knew it meant, my parents would die, I would, have to, and I had, in hindsight, I did all this, have to sell the house that they've lived in and saved stuff in since 1975, right? So, my dad died and I supported my mom, and my then husband and I, we moved in with my mom to support her. And I mean, she didn't need it, health-wise, but, sort of emotionally. And then 6 years after my dad died, my mom died. And that both of their deaths were not suicide, but health related and sudden. And, when my mom died, again, now we're living in my childhood home, which my parents had had since 1975, and the basement reflected that. And it was a good size house. And, so here I am in a house that on my sole income I couldn't afford. By this point, I was divorced. My kids were, in high school or college. And I needed to clean out and sell that house, and all on me, right? When you lose your only sibling, all of those sort of, family responsibilities fall on me. And both of my parents were the youngest of their chunk of siblings, so all of my cousins are much older and spread all over the country. So I don't have any family nearby. I really don't. So, all of this, was on me, and I navigated it all. And, and like I said, I'm in a new house and a new marriage and a new, and I love my life now. But when I think back, like, how it's so strange to think that the way that my family chose, and it was a choice. I think, in the beginning, you don't know that you have this choice, but you do. The way that we chose to respond to John's suicide and the way that we actively engaged in it and, did work around it and did work with it and, engaged with peers and spoke about it. And I know that that helped me, and I hope it helped my mom and my dad, in the years they had left. But I know that that helped me with all of the other stuff that was, that was coming down the road for me, right? In life. Because here's the thing, life is going to keep on lifing at us, right?
Yeah,
Even,
it doesn't
we can
stop.
experience, no. It doesn't, we don't get excluded, or, we don't get exempted from the rest of stuff because we had one really big, bad, defining,
It,
terrible
as
thing,
much
right?
as we want to wave that white flag, it's just not
Yes.
realistic. Yeah.
Right,
Right.
right. Or I've paid my dues.
Yeah. Enough's
Yeah. I
enough.
mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a very real feeling, right? Like, oh, come on. Like, you know, oh, God only gives us what we can handle. Okay, I'm done. Like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I don't want to be strong anymore. When people, oh my gosh, you're so strong. Yeah, I don't want it. Can you stop
Yeah.
it? I don't want this.
I
Like,
didn't ask for this.
right. I don't want this.
There's something
Um,
that comes to mind whenever you're just talking. You started off with, I'm in a really good place. I love life.
mhm.
That might be a contradictory statement for some of our listeners. And I think it's very powerful just to call out because I think that there's hope and there's growth. The whole point of this
Yeah.
podcast is turning grief into growth. It's the journey of transformation. So with that, I often tell people that their time does not heal all wounds. I think we've
Mm-mm.
been, sold a bill of goods with that statement. I don't know where
Yep.
that even started. I
Yep.
know people are 10, 15, 20 years out that have never started their grief journey and have
I agreed.
suppressed it, and
Yep.
it just rises to the surface like a cancer. But I would say that I always tell people it's important to put the work in.
Mhm.
And it sounds like, Kim, just in summing up what you've shared, not to cut you off from
Mm.
continuing, it just really sounds like you have really put the work in, whether it's the peer support, whether it's the work on, the Black Box Project, whether it's the TAPS
Mhm.
work, whatever it is. You could just see a lot of growth and transformation in your life and in your conversation from that.
Well, and I think, in thinking about hope, right? In the beginning, after these losses, it feels unfathomable, right? Like, how will we survive this? How will we, after John died, how is my family going to survive this? How are my parents ever going to be happy again, right? But yet then they still have me and they have grandchildren, and and then, again, these further things happen and we think like, how am I going to do this? How am I, that's, I think, one of the magical things about peer support and engaging and doing the work is because when you meet other people, they are living, breathing examples of the survivableness of this, right? When
Yeah.
you're in a place and you can't see it, you know, when you expose yourself, and there's where some of the choice lies, right? when you expose yourself to others, now look at just because they are 2, 5, 10 years out longer than you doesn't mean they have all the answers, right? But usually their hair is brushed, their teeth look brushed, their shoes match, like, and
Yeah.
that alone is an installation of hope,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Right.
okay,
Get
if
up in the morning,
they,
make your bed. Yeah.
yeah, if they can do it, then it must be able to be done. And that's really what I think the power of, of that connection, that hope, what that can do for people is why I have chosen, if I can link to the Black Box project that you mentioned,
Please do.
why I have
Yeah.
chosen to sort of dedicate my career to caring for and working with and advocating for people who are impacted by such traumatic losses. The Black Box Project is a really unique thing. So it's a program of a larger nonprofit, and this larger nonprofit is called Stop Soldier Suicide. And on the clinical end of the house, so what Stop Soldier Suicide does as a service is provide clinical telemental health care to active duty and veterans. If you are wearing or have ever worn a uniform, a U.S. military uniform, and um, have any sort of need around mental health support, you can engage in our treatment. And it literally is clinical treatment. We have clinicians, and they use best practice based therapies, and they really do specialize because we extensively train them in suicide, in folks who are struggling with suicide through that acute crisis period. That's not the side of the house that I work on, but the way that Stop Soldier Suicide is run is almost like a startup, and that lends itself to new novel ideas and new approaches, and us thinking like, okay, this problem of suicide, the needle hasn't really moved in so many years.
Yeah.
The prevention world, like what are we not doing? How are we missing what, how are we the DoD and the VA, and and almost like a public health campaign, we have put so much money into suicide prevention, and yet we're still losing far too many. One is too many, but we're losing, far too many. Oh, I think around 50,000 a year in the country. So the Black Box Project was, I didn't conceive of it. I kind of wish I did, but I didn't. It was before me. But it is a suicide prevention data science initiative. But it also is a way that families can engage and impact prevention as a legacy to their lost loved one. So, what it is, if you think about the context of aviation, right? We know what a black box is in aviation. When an aviation accident occurs, that black box exists to tell us, what was happening before them in the seconds, in the minutes, in the hours, days, weeks, and even longer before that accident occurred. We would want that data to use it for prevention, right? Same exact concept, only here, the black box are people's digital devices. So, what the Black Box Project does is we borrow digital devices from families who have lost a loved one to suicide. When we started this project, we were working with exclusively military and veteran families, but earlier this year, 2025, we expanded it to all suicide
Mm.
surviving families. So any family, civilian, military, doesn't matter, that has experienced a suicide loss can participate in this. And they loan us these devices. We copy the data that lives on those devices. We do not connect them to the internet. We don't log into apps or anything like that. We copy the data that lives there. The data immediately gets depersonalized and de-identified. So anything that would identify a person's name, a pronoun, a anything that might look like a string of digits that could be a bank account number or a social security number or a phone number, that gets redacted. All of that data gets pooled with all the other data that we have collected thus far, and we analyze that data, looking for behavioral trends and patterns in people's digital life that shows risk, that indicates risk and indicates, that is showing places where interventions can be built. So using this data to save lives, but what I get to do, and it's a privilege, is to engage with the families that loan
Mm.
us these devices. They don't get a report back that, or anything that says, here's what we found on this phone. We don't do that. Um, they get to know that their loved one's data matters, right? That it contributes to this information that we are going to share with the entire field. In fact, we already are. We've got some pretty high, well-known Ivy League colleges, their universities, their research teams that are partnering with us because this data is so powerful. um, to know that your loved one, we can't change the past, we can't change what happened, but maybe what we could learn from them can impact and save another life, right? Save another family from experiencing what ours has. So that's the Black Box Project. And it's super, like I said, it's super innovative and and really, really neat and catching the eye in, of tons of big names in the suicide prevention world. But what I love about it most is, like I said, that the families say it provides a bit of meaning and
Mm.
purpose to this loss, to their grief. And that is something that I think those of us who experience profound loss like this, we just seek that, right? Make it mean something. I can't change it. I can't change that I have to go through this pain, but make it mean something,
Yeah.
right?
Do you
So that's
know,
what I get to
Kim,
do.
is there any talk or thought about maybe expanding to include civilians in that black box? I know,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah,
Yes. So this year, we expanded it to all families. So it's not just military or veteran
2025.
families. It's yes, early this year. So in 2025. So now going forward, I'm actively seeking to find families to, explore the idea of participating, explore the idea of lending us their loved ones' devices. And we look for cell phones, excuse me, tablets and laptops. Those are the three devices that and again, we borrow them, right? It's not a donation. You
I
get them back. And yeah,
I
any family that would like to participate, we would love to explore it with them.
I believe that the work that I'm doing currently might be able to uh, get you some, more
Oh, that'd be awesome.
phones, and yeah,
Yeah.
that would be.
Yeah. The more data, the better, right? As any
Yeah.
sort of data science project, the more data we have, the stronger we can stand on this. Just this past summer, we released our first chunk of findings from this pro. It's called a white paper. It's on our website. Fascinating findings, right? And what we had hoped was that it would show real places where interventions can be built, right? I think about, my Apple Watch knows when I fall down the stairs and it can call 911 for me. There's got to be a way that we can build something that doesn't trample all over people's personal freedoms and liberties and privacy, but also can see when they're struggling
Yeah.
and have something happen
I
to help
I
save
actually
them.
read those white pages. I had no idea that you were part of the Black Box Project.
That's
I've got
me.
a connection that
Ah,
his son died in the military of suicide, and he had forwarded on that report to me, and I
oh
looked at it, and it
wow.
was like 35 pages, and I
Uh,
kind of like was like I don't know if I have time to read all this, and I opened
read the
it up, and
executive summary.
I started reading it, and it was very insightful. And not to
Yeah,
speak out of turn, but there was stuff that was found out, like if you're using your phone device or electronic device at late hours or wee hours of the morning, there was a kind of indicators of that prior to suicide taking place, and some different
yeah,
things. And I think
yeah,
it's like you said, the military's thrown so much money out. I know they put room darkening blinds in Alaska whenever it was daylight 20 hours out of the day, and they thought maybe that would be something that was causing it, and they've just kind of thrown a lot of spaghetti at the wall to see what would stick, as well as the
yeah,
civilian world. And there definitely has to be more of a proactivity versus reactivity to
yeah,
it, because
yeah,
part of this podcast, we do not want there not to be hope for people that have experienced this
yeah,
loss, but we also want to make sure that we're spelling out the mental health category for those that are listening that might have some suicidal thoughts. And I'll start with me and say that I have had suicidal thoughts after my son died. I'm coming up on 5 years. My wife has
mm,
had them. So I like to be able to take the taboo out of the topic of suicide and bring it into the everyday norm, as well as the stigma. There were several things, and Don, I want you to comment. But man, I tell you, Kim, you were an incredible guest. We are so
Mm,
honored to have you on. This might
thank
have
you.
to be one of those continuation conversations we have you on another time. But
Sure.
I jotted down several things about there's this whole aspect of before John died and after John died. I look at the BC AD timeline, and
Yeah.
everything for me is BD AD, before David died and after David died. And
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine life before, because all you can remember is from that point in time on in so many ways. You had mentioned that. You didn't know your uncle who died in a plane crash. And I think that really spells out a lot of aspects to grief, that it is definitely, we grieve hard because we loved hard. It's not that you didn't know your
Yeah.
uncle, but there's an aspect of just really knowing the person you had the loss with, and it really
And we
impacts
get to
harder.
grieve, right? We
Right.
only grieve people that we love, and that's a
Yeah.
privilege, right? I mean,
Right.
there's gonna be someone who tragically is maybe killed in a on a freeway today. I
Yeah.
don't know them, so I'm not going to grieve them. But I mean,
That's right.
grief is a privilege for those that we have that
Yeah,
connection
Grief,
with.
grief is the continuation of love.
it
Yeah.
is.
And yeah,
Yeah, and then there was just you had mentioned. I'm just going down my notes. I just really wanted to call out. There were no warning signs that you saw
Mm,
for John. Looking back,
yeah.
I think that is something that is stereotypical. That people always say, "Well, did you see the warning signs? Why didn't you do something before?" And I think it's powerful to call out that there are not always warning signs
Right.
there. And then you had mentioned with your kids just about kind of, I don't know if I use this word, but owning the suicide, and the fact
Yeah.
that a lot of times I hear, whether my son died while intoxicated, while driving. A lot of times I hear with overdoses, I hear the term accidental overdose.
Hmm.
There's a lot of different things that survivors, I think, are embarrassed to actually come out and to say, or
Shame.
even to
Yeah.
explain it. But I think
Yeah.
there is power. It took me a while. Don knows this. I made many phone calls to him, trying to wrap my head around the fact that David was intoxicated, and it was a shame factor for me and my family.
Mm,
And now I just openly talk about it because I know that there's other 21-year-olds out there that are driving intoxicated. And if I could use him as an example of what not to do, then hopefully I could save a life. So, Don, I'll turn it
right.
over to you if you have some follow-up questions, and I'll close this out a little bit.
I don't have any follow-up questions, but I feel like this is our first episode that we have a guest on, and I feel like we just set the bar way too high,
Yeah.
Greg. Um,
Especially for me and you going forward.
right. Like,
uh,
how do we top this? Kim,
Oh
I
my
can't
goodness.
thank you enough
Hmm.
yeah.
for everything that you have shared, and you are truly you have turned grief into growth,
Hmm.
and you know the jump, the 14,000 parachute jump. It somehow or another was transformational, even though you mentioned that it wasn't. There was maybe not grief related, but there was something that
Yeah.
that did that has uh, just kind of for me changed the way I perceive things,
Mm,
and I feel like it's a really good metaphor for grief. Grief, we just like both of you have said, there's the before and the after,
mm,
and it changes our perception. When we lose somebody that we love, our perception on life changes. And I think you really illustrated that so
mm,
well in how you showed up today. So thank you so much. Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
mm. Thank you for having me. I appreciate being able to tell the story so much because, like I said, there were just so many people in my life that were that installation of hope. And if I can do that, I mean, and honestly, it might be a little selfish, right? It can sound altruistic, but I get to talk about my brother. I get to talk about my
Yeah.
family, and and who doesn't love to do that? I would love to take you up on your offer, Greg, to come back because there's even more that I'm doing
Oh,
for
nice.
siblings because
Yeah.
I have obviously just such a heart for siblings, not just suicide surviving siblings, but all surviving siblings. So I've got something in the works coming early next year that I'll say stay tuned, and I'd love to tell you more in the future. So
Yeah, and I would say stay tuned. We'll definitely have you back. I
Yeah.
mean, this is
I would love
definitely
that.
impactful, and I think there's a lot
Yeah.
for the world to hear in
Mhm.
this. The thing that if I was to sum up this whole thing, I would say that it was just so impactful to me that the cleanup man that came in after John's
Yeah.
suicide is now the gravitas of where you are today.
Hmm. Yeah.
And who would have
Yeah.
ever have thought that, the guy that's bringing in, cleaning equipment and, loves enough to carry some books around. And,
Yeah.
and trust me, we've
Yep.
all been given books. And a lot of times the last thing I want is another book handed to me. I get it. But just even a, hand
Yeah.
personal written note or pointing in the right direction, I think it's just so powerful with
Yeah.
that.
Yep. Yep.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. I
You're
did want to
welcome.
mention something. Since you are our first guest, this has absolutely zero reflection on you. I think this is more for us going forward, Don, that the views and opinions expressed by our guests, and my gosh, I would say by Don and I, for the most part, might not be the views and opinions expressed by you. Sometimes there might be some political comments, sometimes there might be some religious comments, different things going forward that you disagree with, and that's okay. I would just say, show us grace with that, and just know that we are doing our best to really have a well-rounded conversation on turning grief into growth. And some people express things a little differently, and there's definitely a whole gamut of different journeys out there. So we don't want to censor that. We want to make sure that people feel liberated to be able to share their heart and express their journey. But just know that if it's not the opinion shared by you, that's okay. Please continue to listen and show us grace as we move forward and figure this whole thing out. So, Kim, thank you so much for
Thank you
sharing
for having
today.
me.
It really warmed my heart. And Don, as always, thank you so much for being my co-host with this.
Thank you
Thank you so
both.
much.
I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen. We hope turning grief into growth spoke to your heart and becomes a part of your own journey of healing and transformation. If you know someone who could use a little hope, please share this episode with them. And don't forget to follow, like, or subscribe on your favorite platform so you don't miss what's coming next. Don and I can't wait to share more conversations to help you keep turning your grief into growth. Until next time.